Colonel Gage lost control of his scout troops, who panicked and fled, leaving behind 2 cannon undamaged, which the French captured and turned on the British forces. Chaos reigned as the Indians, overwhelming the troops, attacked the supply wagons. They began pillaging, and their break-off of the assault is likely responsible for the larger number of British troops who survived. Within 2 hours, nearly 1,000 of Braddock's men, including 60 officers, were hit, killed or wounded. Later, it was determined that much of this carnage was deemed friendly fire, that is, friend killing friend, due to panic, inability to see, and being trapped in Braddock's constrained tactics of standing and firing in ranks. The British officers on horseback in their bright red tunics with silver gorget on their chests made excellent targets. Soon, leadership was effectively neutralized. After having 4 horses shot from beneath him, General Braddock was shot through the chest and fell. Colonel Hallett, 44th Regiment commander, was dead. Colonel Dunbar, 48th Regiment commander, was not up to his role. Washington, who had accompanied Braddock as an aide, took command and managed to extricate the remainder of live British troops. Braddock was loaded on an ammunition wagon in the retreat. He died on the road 4 days later and was buried in the road, his body many years later discovered and moved to his present burial site above a section of Braddock's Road. Retreating to Fort Cumberland, Colonel Dunbar and the 48th Foot continued on to go into winter quarters in Philadelphia in July. The 44th Foot, eventually rebuilt, continued to serve in the French and Indian War. But with the destruction of Braddock's force, comprising not only regular British troops, but also many men who had served in militia units, there were no defense forces left to protect the Virginia frontier families. Indians, under the leadership of the Canadian French officers, used Braddock's Road as an easy route to move eastward from Duquesne and attack the settlements. Many families were killed, homes burned, crops destroyed, stock stolen, and women and children made captive and taken away. Most settlers abandoned their lands and fled east, back to Fredericktown or south into the Carolinas. Joseph Edwards, his wife and 4 children, refused to abandon their home. With his sons and neighbors, Edwards built a palisaded stockade about his house and outbuildings, where he and his few remaining neighbors could take refuge from rampaging Indians. He had a spring at his back door, and his home backed on the Cacapon River. There's evidence Edwards's fort was attacked at least once, perhaps more, but it was never taken. In the fall of 1755, Washington was named colonel, commanding the Virginia Regiment. Implementing a joint plan with the governor and his advisors, he envisioned an arc of forts reaching from Fort Cumberland in Maryland south to the North Carolina border. He began building Fort Loudon in Winchester to serve as his headquarters. Edwards's fort, or Fort Edwards, became an important link in this plan, as it stood 1 day's ride west of Winchester and provided security for troops on the march between Forts Loudon and Cumberland, the main logistics base for the Western forces. Along that route, a second day's march west led to Pearsall's Fort, now Romney, a third day to Fort Ashby, and from Ashby, a final day's ride or march brought them to Fort Cumberland. In the spring of 1756, a force of about 100 Virginia Regiment troops were marching from Fort Loudon to Fort Cumberland and had bivouacked at Edwards's. In the morning, they moved on north, but found the river at high flood and they could not cross. They returned to Edwards's and bivouacked a second night. Early the following morning, on April the 18th, 1756, a soldier went out to check the horses and spotted an Indian at the forest edge. The mission of this body of troops was to find and destroy these bands of Indians. So the soldier reported to his commander, and the officer immediately sent out a party of about 40 soldiers to try to follow the brave, hoping he'd lead the troops to a war or hunting party. And he did lead them there, straight into an ambush.